If you were to go to the library, whenever it opens that is, and if you were to browse the history section, if that subject would appeal to you, and if you were to pull out an old dusty book that covered the Middle Ages, if of course that era was fascinating to you, and finally if you would flip through the pictorial section, I'm sure your eyes would eventually fall upon a picture of an old castle. There are so many interesting things about castles, those fortified residences of nobles and lords. But one of the fascinating features found in some of those old castles was the deep wells that were used to supply the residents in time of a siege. You see, if the castle was dependent on an outside source for its water, those dwelling inside would be at the mercy of the enemy who could cut off the aqueduct that fed the castle. But you see, the foe had no power over a well found within the castle walls. This morning I want to simply remind you that the enemy of our soul has no power over the well of peace inside the castle of our heart. You know, I think the disciples needed this reminder in John chapter 20, and I wonder if maybe we could also use the reminder today. In this post-resurrection encounter, Jesus reminds us that we can experience an inner peace in the midst of life's uncertainties. Let's read the scripture account beginning with verse 19 and conclude with verse 21. Then the same day at evening, being the first day of the week, this is the same day that Jesus appeared to Mary at the tomb, later on to the ladies, and then yet later still to the disciples on the road to Emmaus. Later on that evening, when the doors were shut, where the disciples were assembled for fear of the Jews, came Jesus and stood in the midst and saith unto them, Peace be unto you. And when he had so said, he showed unto them his hands and his side. Then were the disciples glad when they saw the Lord. Verse 21, Then said Jesus to them again, Peace be unto you. This truth that Jesus conveys is a pertinent and relevant truth for us today as disciples of Jesus. Verse 19 tells us that the doors were shut where the disciples were assembled for fear of the Jews. The word here for shut indicates that the door was locked. And with this mental picture of locked doors and closed windows, we kind of catch a glimpse of the disciples' feelings and emotions. Following the crucifixion and now the reports of the risen Lord, they were filled with fear and uncertainty and confusion. No doubt they feared the Roman guards as they would think about them forcing their way into that room where they were gathered. They were definitely uncertain of all that the day's events meant for them. Confusion swept over their hearts and minds as things did not play out as they had hoped. And as these emotional disciples were assembled together, Jesus came and he stood in the midst of them. Can you just imagine that? Jesus didn't knock. No one opened the door where they were gathered. Jesus simply slipped into the room. Jesus appeared to the disciples in their fear, their uncertainty and confusion. Jesus stepped into their world. You know, as Christians, we sometimes are filled with those same emotions. We are fearful of our present circumstances. We are uncertain of life's realities. We are confused as to the purposes and plans of God. I've been there. You've been there. Perhaps some of you have even faced some of these very emotions this week. And if you'll notice, life doesn't stop when we face these emotions, does it? I'm sure for the disciples, life continued for them. They had to eat. No doubt they had to go places. They had to communicate with people. And so it is for us. Life continues on. We fill up the car with gas when it gets empty. We buy some groceries when the pantry runs low. We talk with those who speak to us. We deposit the check at the bank and we pay the bills. And And as life happens, we can sometimes find ourselves in a room with locked doors and windows, fearful, anxious, confused, and depressed. But I want you to know that in these moments, Jesus steps into our hearts. Jesus shows up. There is no locked window or barricaded door that can keep Jesus out. And when he steps into our midst, he brings what we need. Listen to how verse 19 concludes. Jesus says to them, "Peace be unto you." Oh yes, this is a common greeting, but don't you think it's also a reminder to them of his peace that he was leaving for them? 3 different times in verses 19 through 26, Jesus says these words. Jesus was interested in his followers experiencing peace in the midst of their present circumstances. Here they are tired. Here they are afraid. Here they are worried. And Jesus slips in. And you know, it's still his plan for disciples today. Jesus wants you to experience peace. Maybe you've allowed the circumstances of life to rob you of the peace you once had. And so I want to offer you one piece of advice that will bring peace again to your heart. It's not a new discovery. It's not a profound thought. It's quite elementary, and yet it can be revolutionary for your life. Here it is. Write it down. Look to Jesus. Look to Jesus. You say, "Pastor Andy, I wanted something deeper this morning. I wanted something expositional." Well, I'm sure there's more in the text we could discover, and I'm sure there is some orator who could say something more beautifully, but maybe the simplicity is what we need today. You see, I have my doubts that the disciples were looking at the doors and windows when Jesus showed up, or after Jesus showed up. No, they turned their eyes toward the one who stepped into their midst. And with their eyes fixed on Jesus, he granted them peace. Putting your eyes on circumstances or the uncertainties of life will always result in anxiety, fear, and a host of other emotions. But turning our attention to Jesus will bring us peace that Scripture describes as that which passes all understanding. We began talking about the well within the castle. The siege on the outside could not rob the residents of the supply on the inside. And child of God, I want to remind you, the issues that surround you can never remove the peace that is in you. Keep your eyes on him, and he'll keep his peace in you. The promise is true. Thou wilt keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on thee.